Flavian Hypothesis of Christian Origins proposes that the impetus that gave rise to the Christian religion occurred with the change of Roman dynasty when the Julio-Claudians gave way to the Flavians. The Flavians, in this view, were directly or indirectly involved in the formation of the new religion, which ought to be seen in the context of Roman imperial interests in Judea. In its starkest form, the hypothesis proposes that the Christian religion was the result of deliberate Flavian design, or rather the starkest view, the everyman version, has it that the Christian religion was a cynical conspiracy by the Flavians to exercise control over the masses, as it said. The hypothesis depends upon circumstantial evidence and the plausibility of realpolitik, and then upon certain highly creative readings of Christian texts. It is a radical hypothesis, certainly. It proposes that, to some degree or other, the Christian religion, or we could initially say the Christian movement, a type of Judaism for Gentiles, is a fabrication, and our view of early Christian origins in that history is fundamentally and comprehensively mistaken. Indeed, the hypothesis proposes that our normative history is a constructed, even an official history. The Flavian hypothesis must consequently be classified as a fringe hypothesis. It doesn't appear in academic narratives, but it has a growing following among talented amateurs and outsiders and interested intellectuals. It offers an alternative reading of Christian origins that departs from all accepted norms. In this reading, we need to admit a plain but rarely accepted fact. In the ancient world, religion was not a matter of personal conscience so much as public policy, and the Roman Imperium thought nothing of initiating, inaugurating, promoting and promulgating religious cults as required, not least as a means of legitimizing political power. We are scandalized by the idea of governments taking an active role in these affairs, but only because we regard that separation of powers as historically normal. In the Roman context, there is nothing untoward about the idea that the Romans were actively engaged in religion-making and more broadly myth-making. All the evidence is that they were very good at it. This is especially the case with the Flavians. The Julio-Claudians were gods. Witness the way they crafted the myths, history and literature of their divinity, the way they grafted themselves to the sacred history of Troy. The Flavians were military men. The new regime required legitimacy. We have evidence that certain myths and prophecies were fabricated with the rise of the Flavians to bring legitimacy to the new dynasty. So a certain machinery was created to produce the books, write the history, take control of ideas. We have startling evidence of this project in the works of Flavius Josephus, the Jewish traitor. The place of the Jewish war and the sack of the temple was crucial. Its importance cannot be overstated in this perspective. It is the pivotal historical event. The fall of the temple was also the rise of the Flavians. What we find in that period is Judaism broken and reshaped by brute Roman power. The character of Jesus, the peace-talking Jew, is in this context a convenient myth countering the ideology of Jewish zealots. It is proposed that the Flavians, in the decades after crushing the Jews, put abroad a counter-Jewish sect to diffuse messianic agitation. Proponents of the hypothesis then have to explain why it is that the Jesus narrative is set earlier than the Jewish war, in the prelude to the rebellion. But they routinely point out that the Gospels, though supposedly written before the war, allude to the destruction of the temple. According to this hypothesis, the Gospels are later compositions, though carefully backwritten. Arguments about passages in the Gospels or Acts of the Apostles that supposedly allude to the Jewish war are a textual locus for this hypothesis. It is significant that the only independent witness to Christ's historicity is in the works of Flavius Josephus. What if we accept that testimony as early? What if it is not a late Christian interpolation into a pagan text? In that case, it has been added to an approved Roman history, and the question becomes, who could do this? The Flavian hypothesis explores such issues with a critical eye and the suspicion that the appearance of the Christians was orchestrated. We have the earlier example of Mithraism to use as some evidence. This religion prospered among Roman soldiers throughout the Roman Empire in an earlier period. It appears to be an imitation of an Eastern cult, yet it expands not from the East but out of Rome itself, and it appears to be an endorsed religious phenomenon in the Roman army. By one account, it is an example of the Roman state inventing and promoting a religion. It may well be that there was a pre-existing Jesus cult in Judea. It is not likely that the Flavians or anyone else concocted a new religion out of nothing. But in any case, the Flavian hypothesis proposes that the Flavian administrations took an active hand in its development and dissemination. How far this extended is another matter, but clearly the new religion took on a life of its own. Patterns in later literature provide the strongest evidence, because the first Flavian emperor, Vespasian, is routinely portrayed as either sympathetic to the Christians, or as the instrument of the Christian God, or as a Christian himself in some cases. This is because he destroyed the temple to punish the Jews for crucifying Christ. The conflation of the crucifixion with the destruction of the temple is commonplace in Christian literature and tradition. It is enormously interesting under this hypothesis. There is a literature to be studied and decoded. Vespasian emerges as a Christian hero who is the instrument of God's justice. We know that the Flavians engaged in the wholesale rewriting of history. Josephus boasts as much. We also know that the Flavians took thousands of Jewish scribes, highly literate people, into slavery and placed them in the state apparatus, using them to forge a new imperial mythology. The Flavians looked to Eastern and Jewish prophecy to justify their ascendancy. This is the point in Roman history where the East moved west, where Jerusalem went to Rome. By any account, the Flavians had the manpower and the brain power to exercise comprehensive ideological control. Witness the might depicted on the Arch of Titus. In this view, New Testament literature consists of elaborate forgeries crafted under Roman guidance by Greek-speaking scribes. The purpose of the project was to seed the empire, especially the East, with a Roman-friendly, compliant and non-militant alternative to Jewish radicalism. Advocates of the hypothesis feel that Christianity simply served Roman political interests too well and was too convenient to Roman purposes to have come about without some degree of official endorsement. They maintain in any case that the Christian religion is not the natural outcome of Second Temple Judaism. The historical record is highly suspicious because Christian literature appears to be an almost enclosed in-house literature. Almost no Christian figures appear anywhere outside of Christian literature. It is peculiarly isolated. There is no corresponding archaeological record, which begins much later. We rely upon texts, and proponents of the theory see Flavian fingerprints all over our textual record. What is at stake here is the status of historical religion. We might be taken aback by the Flavian hypothesis, or even shaken by the idea that the entire Christian edifice was an outcome of raw political power. But in fact, all historical religion is equally shaky. The Jewish narrative itself has been rewritten by the rabbis, mainly from earlier forgeries and pseudepigrapha. I'll wager that Moses is more myth than history. But then it seems very unlikely there was a historical figure corresponding to the Buddha, and even less likely that there was a historical Lao Tzu. And as for Islam, there was a 200-year hiatus before the official history was written. Muhammad was perhaps historical, a Dark Age warlord, but very little of his life preserved in Muslim hagiographies can be confirmed as historical fact. Modern scholarship is slowly revealing that much of the history of early Islam was fabricated and backwritten through a pious lens. Indeed, All the historical religions appear to be on shaky ground as far as their historical claims are concerned. So this radical mode of criticism is not only to be applied to Christianity, it is a much wider problem. The historical claims of religions rarely hold water. It is an acute problem for Christianity because it is so conspicuously historical, and indeed the historicity of the Incarnation is a matter of dogma. More than other religions, Christianity proclaims a divine intervention into history. In its context, its novelty was that it was not mythological, unlike the paganisms it challenged. But its historical consciousness was Roman, not Judaic. It is only pseudo-Judaic. Scholars have spent the centuries searching for the roots of Christianity in Judaism, but this was a decoy. The Protestants were entirely mistaken in this case, and the claims of the Catholics that Rome was the true centre of early Christianity turns out to be more true than we ever imagined. The Church seems to grow out of the Roman civil service. It adopts canon law, the vestments, liturgies, offices, and rites from the Roman civil service. Under the Flavian hypothesis, the Gospel narrative and the Jesus myth are in essence Flavian allegories concerning the Jewish war, including the events that led to the revolt, cast as a parallel but fictitious history laced with material and episodes turning the tables on Jewish messianic fanatics. The Romans were brutal, but also superstitious. They were not immune to real concerns about desecrating the temple of the Jewish God. As it happened, that desecration was also the birth of the new Roman dynasty. The siege of Jerusalem was set as the new Trojan War, a defining historical event with consequences in the realms of the gods, a shift of divine favour. But the desecration had to be justified. The justification came in the form of the story that the Jews had murdered their own Messiah, and Vespasian was the agent of divine vengeance. Manifest destiny. Temple fell. The troops proclaimed Vespasian emperor. The gods smiled upon him. We can see then the general shape of the Flavian hypothesis. The very idea of the God-man was not intrinsically Jewish according to this view. It was rather a Julio-Claudian idea, here repurposed by the following dynasty. It might seem an unnecessarily Machiavellian reading of early Christian history, and perhaps this is what it amounts to, with shocking results. It was already foreshadowed in the Tübingen school of biblical criticism in the 19th century, but goes much further. Of course, it is a favoured new theory among radical atheists and Christianity haters. It is almost impossible to lift such a radical proposal out of that sort of intense polemic. It's best to step back from it and consider it in a much broader and deeper context. It asks us to rethink the complex relations between history and myth, for example. Let us ask why religions started to take historical forms in the first place. It is not a small question. And then there is the category of sacred history. This is like a history written on top of history. How are we to understand it? What models and metaphors can we bring to it? Whatever happened, Christianity soon developed into something much more than a Roman propaganda project. Whatever the Flavians might have done, it was only a piece of historical grit around which shaped the pearl of great price, is how we might construe it. Or else we can use tectonic metaphors. In the Jewish war, two great continents, East and West, Roman and Parthian if you want to be geopolitical, collided. After the earthquakes, Christianity was part of the new landscape. The hypothesis has the virtue of drawing attention to the change of dynasties in Rome as epoch-making. The fall of the temple, the rise of the Flavians, and the appearance of Christianity all coincided in the latter half of the first century. This is the best historical matrix in which to search for the roots and origins of the Christian religion. Roman power was as elemental as nature. The Roman control of and production of literature was in phases almost absolute. Josephus is straightforward about the ruthless eradication of books and authors who dared disagree with his history. We severely underestimate the extent of Roman control of literature and religion, nor do we appreciate the extremely sophisticated array of literary devices available to these writers: dissembling, transposition of names, encodings, shifts of location, allusions, plays and puns. It was the Christians themselves who preserved the writings of Josephus. They treated them like they were part of the canon. His works, official Flavian literature, travelled with the Gospels. Christianity came with Flavian history. The official approach to early Christianity, it's especially Protestant, is to think of it as a history that was subsequently mythologized. But there's a body of opinion and a suite of hypotheses that put it the other way around. The Flavian hypothesis asks if this historicizing of myth, or the myth itself, was under state control. It's a natural question to ask. Our historical consciousness itself may be the ultimate problem here. For much of Christian history, all of this hardly mattered. What prevailed was what we might call a cosmic Christianity. In medieval or Romanesque depictions of the crucifixion, it's a symbolic event. Only as we move into modernity does it start being depicted as historical. For most of Christian history, the Gospel was known as a picture book of eternal events. Only mass literacy and the printing press caused it to harden into a written history. Modern Christians have pinned their hopes on history. The modern faith is underpinned by an historical edifice that might now be unsustainable. Proposals like the Flavian hypothesis are in any case a challenge to the comfortable assumptions shared universally by Christian and secular viewpoints. Make no mistake, the Flavian hypothesis is generally promoted by people who want to see Christianity unravel. But there are proponents with a dispassionate interest in the roots of Christianity and more generally all the religious outcomes of the Second Temple period and its aftermath. What is needed, though, is a more general view of the formation of religion and myth and a much better appreciation of the polis, the state, as a religious agent. Let's start from the proposition that all religions are noble lies. Religions are gatherings of all the stories, ideas, symbols and motifs necessary for the sustained contemplation of higher things, regardless of the brutal mechanics of political forces that shape them in the first instance. Anyway, what then becomes fascinating is that this thing grows up to be a monster that eventually devours its creator. This Eastern cult conquered the empire. The church survived the empire and preserved and continued the empire. If Christianity began under Flavian inspiration or instigation as a device to quell the hearts and minds of the rebellious East, it certainly prospered beyond its original purpose. Arguably, it's an old argument, it became a life raft for the best of classical culture as the Roman Empire eventually fell into decline. And it also becomes fascinating that its logic transcends its origins. The meaning of the crucifixion in the Christian story, surely, is that there is a power greater than the power of Rome. You can take a man and torture him and nail him to a cross to die, but there is something you cannot touch, something against which Roman power and the whole 10th Legion is impotent. Somehow this is an unintended consequence. It must count against the Flavian hypothesis, at least in its cynical forms. The new religion, this Judaism for Gentiles, was Roman compliant, and its hero preached peace as an alternative to the Zealots, and it served to neutralize and counter Jewish militancy, and it provided spiritual cover for the desecration of the temple. But in the end, borrowing heavily from the Stoics, it would seem, it also embedded a deep meditation upon the very nature and limits of incarnate power. A civilization needs some attachment to ultimate things. It hardly matters where it comes from, only that it is adequate to its purpose. This idea of adequacy is important in understanding religions. We cling instead to hopes of authenticity.